Kiskút, kerekesút van az udvarunkban, de szép barna kislány van a szomszédunkban. Csalfa szemeimet rá sem merem vetni, fiatal az édesanyja, azt is kell szeretni. Ennek a szép barna lánynak dombon van a háza, sudár jegenye van az udvarában, sudár jegenye a földre hajlik az ága, ennek a szép barna lánynak én leszek a párja. This is my small workshop. It is here that I built many of my furniture in the late 1950s, shortly after I and Elizabeth got married. I learned this trade in my hometown of Dej in the late 1930s and early 1940s on my father's wise advice. He told me, look, you're very good in school, you're best in class, you have a good head, but what in the world will you do in the intellectual field during the Nazi era in this anti-Semitic atmosphere? You must have a trade as well. So in the morning I went to school, in the afternoon I studied this trade. At that time, of course, I had no idea that this little apprentice will one day become a distinguished professor of political science at the City College of the City University of New York.
Randolph Lewis Braham arrived in New York in 1948 from the small Transylvanian town of Dej. Few would guess that one of the most important research centers of 20th century Hungarian history is located in a small office here. The City University of New York Graduate Center sits in the heart of Manhattan on 5th Avenue at 34th Street. Recognized all over the world, Professor Braham is the greatest expert in Hungarian Holocaust studies and is the author of exhaustive works devoted to it. He has written or edited more than 50 books, co-authored more than 30, and published dozens of articles. He has received scores of awards, medals, prizes, and citations for his work. Today, he coordinates a major research project in Romania, Hungary, and Israel. At 82 years of age, Professor Braham travels a lot, but he feels at home only in New York City.
Én nem lakni sehol máshol a világon. Ez a világ központja minden szempontból, financiális, tudományos szempontból, művészeti szempontból, irodalmi szempontból, nem Párizs, nem London, sem Berlin, többé New York. Mindig élvezem nézni a különböző fajtákat, etnikumokat, vallásokat. Sehol máshol a világon nem laknék. Occasionally I have nightmares, but many of these nightmares are connected with my hometown of Dej. I dream that I am back home, and I keep on wondering about myself, what made me leave New York to go back to Dej? you come here, please, this was Strada Codrului in Hungarian Kodoruța. This was the center of Jewish life during the pre-war period, inhabited primarily by Hasidic Jews. It was full, vibrant life. I recall that this was also the road to the pasture, and I was always fascinated to see cows and buffaloes and even horses going in the morning to the pasture at the end of this long road. And in the afternoon, when they came back, I was always amazed to see that cows and the buffaloes find their way home without any nudging on the part of the caretakers. It's really an eerie feeling to be here now, to look around, not to see a single Jew anywhere. This is really what impresses upon me the reality of the Holocaust. My first memories in this area take me back to the little house we had rented from a Christian called Nostrai, and I remember very vividly how I used to play with the daughter, the young little Yulishka, many little games, and together we went over across the street to a bakery, enjoy to see the baking of bread. These buildings were the property of a Dr. Berger, a physician, who used to live in the back of this building. We had a very small apartment, I believe 2 rooms all in all, and lived by selling milk. We had a little barn, and we had several cows. One of them was named Bomba, which was the most productive, and a great tragedy hit us because Bomba suddenly got sick, and as a result of a pathological observation, they discovered that she had swallowed a rusted nail. We had to sacrifice the cow, and for many, many years we had to struggle to recuperate the losses.
Vigyázz, mert belelépsz a sárba.
Dehogy is lépek a sárba. Csak azért, mert öreg vagyok, nem tudsz. Here I am in the midst of my favorite animal, the water buffalo. I used to love to ride on them, and when I was a child I was told that the water buffalo was the source of coffee and that we got the milk from cows. I have many little statues with buffaloes.
Esther Katz, Professor Braham's mother, grew up in this house before leaving for Liège to get married. The current residents came here from the other side of the Carpathian Mountains. They're afraid he's here to claim his grandparents' property. Their fears were not justified. Native villagers still remember some of their 1944 neighbours.
Știu, nu mă cunosc pe când a stat aici domnul Koț Armin, știu.
Ok, Katz Armin este unchiul meu.
Da, îl cunosc eu. Eram ucenici la croitorie pe aici, pe timpul ăla. Da. Era atelier de croitorie atunci.
Bunicul meu, da.
Salut.
Eu sunt nepotul lui Bumi din America și acum fac
Dânsul mai trăiește?
Nu, nu.
A murit. Dar au avut o fată pe Greti, când o plecat de aici. Avea vreo 6 sau 7 ani.
Da.
Alea două nu mai veni cu soția.
Fata lui mai trăiește, e căsătorită acum în Israel. El a murit câțiva ani înainte, nu știu când. Și bunicul și bunica au trăit aici,
Da.
și am venit aici vara pe vacanță când a fost ca Diana.
Pe noi stăteam aici sus, poate și pe
Aici
așa.
a fost jandarmeria atunci.
Da, dar părinții mei stăteau mai jos.
Okay. This was the house of my maternal grandparents, Elish and Rose Katz. They had 6 children. 2 of them emigrated to America. My mother, after marriage, moved to Dej. The others stayed here. As a child, I was brought here for summer holidays. I used to love to roam around this area. It looks so much bigger than now. And in fact, it was bigger because a part of it was demolished. The property extended all the way to that building. And we cultivated all kinds of fruits and vegetables in that area. I remember that in 1928 or 29, this particular well was built, and during the construction period, my grandfather would bring me, a little boy, to the edge of the hole and told me that if I didn't behave, he would throw me in. That remained in my mind ever since. My grandfather was a tailor, and so were his 3 sons. The last one to stay home was Bumi or Armin Katz. My grandfather died in the 1930s. The others became victims of the Holocaust. Bumi managed to escape. He was the only one to escape by hiding in the woods nearby, dressed as a peasant. I first saw him sometime in May or June 1945. When I came to visit him, he tried to re-establish the tailor shop. As a child, I spent much of my time serving the interest of the shop, of the tailor shop. We had lots of flies. The tape was dark, black, with stuck flies. And Bumi, just to get rid of me, he said, look, I'll give you a leo. That was the currency at the time, for every 100 flies that you catch for me. So my job was to line up the dead flies in rows of 10 to demonstrate that I have the 100, and I got my leo. And I developed a technique. I put some little sugar here and there so that the flies congregated, and with one sweep, I caught 20 or 30 flies at a time. So I became rich by the time I went home back to Dej. As I grew older, I spent less and less time catching flies and began to read increasingly more. First, light material, then the literary masters. Clearly, we had no electricity at the time. Nobody in the village had any electricity. And I was compelled to do most of my reading by candlelight. It is here that I read some of the greatest pieces of literature, the masters of French realism, including Balzac, Flaubert, Zola, and even got acquainted with Turgenev and Dostoevsky. Water obviously was drawn from this well. There was no modern WC or toilet. There was an outhouse here. But life was pleasurable. I had quite a number of friends in the community, and Fridays and Saturdays, at least up to the age of 16, I used to go to the synagogue. My hometown of Dej, like Transylvania as a whole, used to be part of Greater Hungary until the end of World War I. My parents, like the parents' generation, the adults in this town, grew up in the golden era of Hungarian Jewry. They spoke Hungarian, and they were representatives of Hungarian culture. In 1940, as a result of an arbitration by the Axis powers, by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Transylvania was split. The northern part that contained the great majority of the Jews, about 164,000, was allotted to Hungary. The southern part, with fewer than 30,000 Jews, remained in Romania. Most of the Jews of the city awaited the entry of the Hungarian troops with great expectation. They were relieved finally because it meant the end of the anti-Semitic program of the Romanian government and of the Iron Guard. I myself, at the time of the entry of the Hungarian authorities, troops, was in the center of this square, standing with a friend of mine under the flags of the Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. And together with the masses of people dressed in their holiday best, with the flags of the country of Hungary now and of the allies, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, I watched how the Hungarian troops were marching into the city. After the reattachment of northern Transylvania to Hungary, the anti-Jewish laws in effect in Hungary were applied in northern Transylvania as well. Dedicated as they were to the Hungarian culture and language, in 1944 they suffered the same fate as their brethren in many parts of Nazi Europe. Socially, we had a wonderful life. Rich and poor danced together, socialized together, went on excursions together. We had really a fascinating life. This building, the so-called Jewish casino, was the center of Jewish social life in Dej. It served as the seat for many activities. The elite, business elite, intellectual elite, would play cards here, even have some weddings occasionally, did their business, and interestingly, at the same time, it was the center for Zionist activities. It served as the seat of many Zionist organizations, ranging from the extreme right, the Jewish Orthodox Aguda, to the extreme left, the Shomer HaTzair. It is here where we young people danced a lot, and we belonged to that particular party to which our friends belonged. It was not an ideological, political orientation, but social concern. This was the city's bordello. It is here where I and almost all of my friends lost our virginity under the care of Szőke Rózsi, or the Blonde Rose. It was she who helped us with great understanding and sensitivity to turn from ignorant adolescents into experienced men. It was difficult to enter the bordello because right next to the bordello was the house of Jacob Singer, where some of my best friends lived. We had to take special care to enter the bordello without being sighted by either the parents or the grandparents who lived here. So we disguised ourselves sometimes and made various tricks to enter without being seen. This was the house of Rabbi Yankov Elimelech Panet, a learned and much loved chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Dezh. He was elected chief rabbi in 1930 after his father, Yeheskel Rabbi, died. He was the last representative of the Panet dynasty. In 1935, he went to Palestine on a visit. He spent there a few months, and in spite of the fact that he was a Hasidic Jew, he came back as a convinced Zionist. Unlike many other spiritual leaders of the Jewish communities in this region and in many other parts of Hungary in 1944, Chief Rabbi Panet, in spite of the fact that he was given an opportunity to be rescued in a special transport, he decided to stay with the community and ended up in Auschwitz together with his congregants. His memory is cherished not only by the survivors of this community, but also by many other people who appreciated the contribution of this dynasty. I believe there is a temple, a synagogue, erected in Bnei Brak in his honor. This was the seat of my father. In this part of the synagogue, mostly workers, artisans, small shopkeepers sat. In front of the bima, the seats were reserved primarily for the well-to-do, for the rich, and the first seats were usually held for the advisors, supporters of the rabbi. I remember that it is from this seat next to my father that I was called to go onto the bima at the age of 13 for the so-called bar mitzvah celebration. After the completion of the celebration, of the ceremony, I was identified as an adult. That is, from that time on, all the sins that I incur were to be mine. My father was absolved. The last time I was in this synagogue was on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year of 1943, just a few weeks before I went to Nagybánya for labor service. I recall very vividly that the synagogue was filled to capacity, not only in this main building, but also in the hall. There was not even standing room. And as was the occasion, the leaders of the city, the mayor, the commander of the police, and of the army were usually invited to sit during the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year celebration. It was a tragic period in a way, because I remember that our rabbi began his service in a normal fashion, but his voice suddenly cracked. He began to cry. His crying became ever louder, and as I looked around, I saw the congregants putting their prayer shawl over their heads and began to cry with the rabbi. I looked at the women's section, and there too I saw women putting their shawl over their heads, and they began to cry as well. I had no idea why. It was different from the previous years. It was only later that I learned that the rabbi was informed that very day that 2 of his sons were killed in the Ukraine. As I was walking in these woods, I was thinking what a nice, quiet, almost idyllic place it is. It is, but it wasn't always so. In May, June 1944, this was the ghetto for the Jews of Dej and of all the communities in Szolnok-Doboka County. This ghetto, in a way, was unique in northern Transylvania. In most other ghettos, the Jews were placed in brickyards or certain former Jewish sections. It is only in Dej that the authorities decided to place the Jews of Szolnok-Doboka County in the woods under the open sky. They lingered here for almost 6 weeks, from May 3rd until about June 6th, when the last transport left from this area. About 22 people died or were killed in the ghetto during the weeks. After the war, sometime in April 1945, former labor servicemen, including myself, decided to exhume the 22 bodies and bury them properly in the Jewish cemetery. What feelings did I experience going back to Dej after 60 years? I felt like a ghost driven by its own shadow, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, from street to street, from building to building, identifying my many friends and neighbors with whom I spent my youth. After we were evicted from the Kolozsvár Street apartment, my parents found an apartment here in the cellar, which was the most primitive way of living in a way. It is from this building that I was taken into labor service in October of 1943. It is here where I last saw my parents and my sister, who were deported, rather taken into the ghetto of Dej on May 3rd, 1944. Both of my parents were killed almost immediately after arrival in Auschwitz. My sister survived and eventually returned to Dej. She came back sometime in June or July 1945. She had lots of pain in her stomach and was taken into the hospital, where she was first diagnosed as having a lump, a large lump, a form of a cancer in her stomach. She was operated, and that lump turned out not to be cancerous. It was in effect a lump of threads, leather, little pebbles, whatever she could chew to ease her hunger pain.
The 10-2 forced labour unit was luckily spared fighting assignments on the front. They did auxiliary work in the Ukrainian Carpathians, but the front caught up with them in the fall of 1944. A Hungarian peasant, István Novák, rescued 5 Jewish forced labourers. The Novák's eldest daughter, Margit, was 9 at the time.
Ott van a kis Margitka, aki itt bélelni. Jöjjön csak le, jöjjön csak le. Jöjjön csak le.
Hát maga ilyen
Itt van
fiatal.
a kis Margit, aki hozta a krumplit nekünk, igaz?
Jaj, Istenem, hogy még maga ilyen fiatalos és él nekem. Maga az én testvérem. Jaj. Elizabeth.
Minden jó van, csókolja.
Nem jött?
Nem, itt van. In late summer, early fall 1944, our labor service unit was stationed in Solotvina, digging military-related fortifications, trenches, for several weeks. Then, in the wake of the Soviet offensive of that period, our company was ordered to march westward. About the middle of December, when our company arrived in a small little hamlet on the border of Slovakia and Hungary called Nyíry. There in the Zemplén mountains, our company was ordered to dig trenches, defense forces. One day, in the wake of the Soviet offensive, our unit was ordered to move further west. 5 comrades, good friends from Dej, we looked into each other's eyes and decided, without any previous preparation, not to go further. We decided to remain here, hide, and we also heard rumors about some partisan forces fighting Nazi and Hungarian units here in the mountains of Zemplén. We decided to join them. We were ill prepared. We didn't have adequate food. Our shoes and clothing were inadequate for the winter of that year. And we marched toward the partisans during the day without finding any traces. We could not find anybody to instruct us as to how to contact them. And we got scared, feeling that our footprints will be discovered by patrols, Hungarian or German, and they would legally shoot us as deserters. We decided to come back to the area of Nyíri and hide. We found a barn, a hay barn, where we decided to cover ourselves, to dig ourselves into the haystack. We expected the entry of the Russian forces in no time because we heard the sounds of the cannons, of the artillery. We were sure that we would be liberated in a day or two. But for some reason, the Soviet offensive stalled. The days passed, and looking through the hole of the barn, we saw that elements of the German and Hungarian army were occupying the trenches that we dug a few days earlier. We didn't dare move, but we got scared one day when somebody came to the barn and began to use a pitchfork to remove hay to feed the horses that carried the cannon, that pulled the cannon to the mountain. We dug ourselves deeper and deeper into the hay and decided to look around and hide somewhere else to save ourselves. One day, we looked around and we saw that the trenches were empty. The German and Hungarian army units withdrew in the wake of the Soviet offensive. It became a no man's land. We breathed much easier. One day, we hear a sound in Hungarian. Boys, relax, you'll be liberated soon. The Russians are very close. You'll find a bucket full of boiled potatoes on the threshold. It turned out that this farmer, this peasant, we discovered that his name was István Novak later on, saw the footprints of one of our comrades who one night went out in search of some food, potato peels, onion peels, whatever. This farmer supplied us with potatoes and other food day and day out. Since the Germans and the Hungarians were already away, we decided to come down from the barn, and at that time we saw the face of this farmer. We were face to face with him, and at his request we went into the stable. He had several cows, and that provided us with many advantages, not only safety against Soviet arms, but also warmth from the cows. We even went into the peasant's home, and he fed us, kept our spirit alive, and indeed one day, I have no idea whether it was 10 days or 2 weeks later, he told us, boys, the Russians are here. They'll arrive in this area today. And indeed, we saw a first soldier of the Red Army without any helmet, half drunk, on patrol, and soon thereafter elements of the Romanian army came. Romania switched sides in August 1944, and from that time on it fought hand in hand, side by side with the Red Army. And when the Romanian captain heard us speak Romanian, he came to us and said, "What's this?" pointing to our tears. He said, these are tears of liberation, of happiness, of joy. He said, from the pen into the fire. And we wanted to denounce this captain to the leaders of the Russian forces as a fascist an enemy of the Allies. But the captain went on with his Romanian unit, and a few hours later, we thought of his warning, because we found ourselves surrounded by elements of the Red Army, and within that circle of Red Army men and women, we found ourselves labor servicemen, our own guards, Hungarians, and other enemies. And on order of the Russian forces, of the Russian commander, we had to form a column, a kind of a POW column, and we were driven back in the direction of Pálháza and Sátoraljaújhely. And on the way, elements of the Red Army advanced. I remember mostly young men and women who spit on us, whipped us, and we had to understand their anger, because they, I believe, were under the impression that we, labor servicemen too, were Nazi soldiers dressed in civilian.
Professor Braham never forgot István Novak's courageous act. He invited Margit to visit him in New York, and, at his recommendation, her father was awarded the Yad Vashem, Righteous Among the Nations title, in Jerusalem, recognizing those who risked their lives to save Jews. A tree was planted at Yad Vashem in István Novak's memory.
The column of prisoners formed by the Soviet guards, a column that included not only former labor servicemen now liberated, but also many of the guards, and also captured Hungarian soldiers and others, were marched toward a prisoners of war camp that the Red Army established near Sátoraljaújhely. It is on this road that was, of course, at the time unpaved and muddy and full of snow, that we had to march until we reached that prisoners of war camp. I have no idea as to how many days we spent there, but to our great luck, we discovered that one of the officers was Jewish, and he even spoke Yiddish. We established contact with him. He was aware of the Jewish predicament. He knew that we were victims of Nazism. He told us that unfortunately he could not do anything for us legally, but he reassured us that one night, when he'll be in charge of the camp, we should meet him at a particular corner. He will open the gate and he would say, "Pashli, get rid," warning us not to march homeward during the day because we might be picked up by military patrols, but we should go on the way home under the cover of darkness. This monument was erected in 1947 in memory of the deported Jews of Dej. I don't think there is another monument like this anywhere in Transylvania today. I'm convinced that there are many more monuments erected to the memory of Marshal Ion Antonescu, the war criminal who was executed in 1946 for his involvement, among other things, in the destruction of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews. I'd like to introduce a friend of mine from the childhood period. His name is Emil Nash. He and I served in the same labor service company, number 10 per 2, with headquarters in Nagybánya.
Ezek szép napok voltak, mégis az ember visszaemlékszik ezekre a napokra. Pusztultak el az emberek, volt ez a hasmenési, hogy hívják, tifusz, de akiben volt élet, az megmarad. És örvendek, hogy rátaláltam. Örvendek, nagyon örvendek.
Oké, akkor minden jó, sok szerencsét. Hát mi jávéjászri, mint ahogy mondják héberül, 120 évig csinált.
Köszönöm nektek, szervusztok, csokolok benneteket, és örvendek, hogy találkoztunk. Na menjek, mert otthon várnak gyerekek. Nagyon örvendek, hogy találkoztunk.
In 1945, there were demonstrations, even in Dej, demanding the repatriation of those who were still stranded in the recently liberated Polish and German concentration camps. Many of those who returned fell for the enticing communist propaganda. Promises of an end to racial discrimination, eternal brotherhood, and equality misled many a survivor. The 22-year-old Adolf Abraham smartly avoided this trap. He stayed away from politics and was determined to join his relatives in the land of his dreams, America. He concentrated on studying English and he watched a lot of Hollywood movies.
Before the war, this was the only movie house in the city. I loved to come to the movies, especially to watch American and Western movies. I loved the so-called cowboy Indian action movies. I liked everything about the American scene. This reinforced in me the desire to go to America, to join my relatives, and in a way saved me had I remained in Dej from politics, from left-wing politics. Happily, it was this that encouraged me to leave this place soon after liberation.
The young man from Dej made it to this refugee camp after crossing the borders of several occupied countries. He made good use of his English by helping several American relief organizations as their representative and interpreter. He was getting closer to making his dream of going to America true.
It was always my desire as a child and adolescent to come to America. This desire was reinforced in me by the many letters and pictures I received from my relatives, most of them emigrated to America after World War I. This desire was eventually fulfilled in January of 1948 when I arrived in America and I saw the Statue of Liberty. And with tears in my eyes, I spoke to myself, Randy, Pizzi, you have achieved your life's objective. You are now in America. But soon as the troop ship arrived, and I was sick all the way from Bremerhaven to New York, the 12 days, I was a bit disappointed because my family, who was awaited for me, waited in vain. The ship was emptied and only 2 of us foreign students were kept on the ship. And it turned out that since we were born in Eastern Europe, we became suspect as potential or actual communists. And we were among the last ones to be taken on police escort to Ellis Island. This is now the Ellis Island Museum. For many, many decades, it used to be the gate of America. Millions upon millions of immigrants came to America via this place, especially between 1880 and 1924. I was among the last ones to be taken to Ellis Island in 1948. As I indicated before, my illusions about America, the ones that I developed in Dej, dissipated to a large extent when the troop ship, the Marine Flesher, was emptied at the end of January 1948, and with another foreign student I was taken here with police escort. It was in this hall that I roamed around for many days, looking longingly at Manhattan. I felt a bit disappointed. I'm so far yet so near. It is from here that I was taken again with police escort to an immigration judge on Columbus Avenue in Manhattan, where eventually I was freed on bond. Disillusioned as I was with my having been taken to Ellis Island, I was also disillusioned by my first encounter with my relatives. In a sense, my cousin, who recognized me in the judge's office, took me by car to my new residence on the Lower East Side, specifically at 309 East 4th Street, where my aunt, Bertha Mark, my father's youngest sister, lived. The images of America and of the rich relatives with their tuxedos and neckties and all that dissipated almost immediately. I discovered that they were in fact very poor working class Jews. Both of them worked very hard in a necktie factory. Their son, Andy, still lived with them. And my new quarters were Andy's room. Not only that I didn't have a room of my own, I also had to share a bed with my cousin Andy. I was 24, he was about 26. It was a bit humiliating, but nevertheless, I cannot reproach my aunt. She was poor, she did her best. She was the only one among my many relatives who was ready and eager to accept me until I established myself in America. For some reasons, I gave up my fellowship that I received while in Germany. As a foreign student, I could not work legally. So in order to survive, I accepted many odd jobs, including washing of windows on top floors, cabinet making, and during the summer, I waited tables. all that changed for the better in the 1950s when I got first my doctorate and then my first position as a instructor in political science. I can conclude that my entire life in America has been intertwined with the City College of New York. I had to register early in February for the 1948 spring semester. I had no idea about the system of education in America. I felt a bit strange with younger students in a class. I was at that time already 24 years of age, but I managed to keep pace with them and eventually graduated from this institution in 1949. After I received my doctorate in the early 1950s, I received my first teaching assignment in 56. I remained as an instructor, then gradually promoted to assistant, associate, and full professor in the course of years. I taught here for about 35 years until my retirement in 1992.
Professor Braham taught comparative politics and international relations. He never taught Jewish history or Holocaust studies. To a certain extent, he attributes his beginnings in Holocaust studies to chance.
I got my doctorate in political science in 1952. Unfortunately, I did not get a teaching position immediately, and to survive, I accepted a job with the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, one of the best-known Jewish institutions in New York, originally established in Lithuania after World War I. Coincidentally, then in 1953, the Yad Vashem Institute was established in Jerusalem for the commemoration and perpetuation of the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The two institutions established a cooperative arrangement for the publication of a series of documentary and bibliographical accounts that is the foundation for future research on this particular subject. I was the head of one of the projects at the YIVO Institute, and in the course of time, we published a number of volumes, bibliographies and documentary volumes, multilingual, which later were used as basic sources for the researching of the Holocaust. The YIVO Institute received carfuls of books and documents captured by the American troops in Germany, and we had to go through all of these books and documents. They pertain to all aspects of European Jewry. I, as a survivor of the Hungarian Holocaust, and my parents and my relatives, victims of the same tragedy, naturally, I was more increasingly interested in the Hungarian chapter and began to set aside books, articles, publications, documents relating to the Holocaust in Hungary. Using that documentation, I began to publish certain aspects of the Holocaust in Hungary. And the climax came in 1960 when the Israeli Secret Service captured Eichmann in Argentina. I began to publish about Eichmann's role in Hungary and about many aspects of the Holocaust in that country. By 1963, I had enough material on Hungary to publish a separate bibliography. And at the same time, I began to publish more and more individual studies. By 1963, I already had an appointment in my own field, political science. And in addition to publishing in my field of specialization, comparative politics, I also published a series of articles on the Holocaust. Then I began to travel the world over, investigating archives from Jerusalem to London, from Bonn to Frankfurt, from Budapest and Bucharest, you name it, collecting anything and everything pertaining to the Holocaust in Hungary. I was the first one to get a hold of the secret documents of the Eichmann division in Bonn. And I made film copies, brought them back home, and I already, in the early 60s, developed an idea. I read a large number of books on this chapter, Hungary. I wasn't satisfied with any. Most of them were lacrimose, that is, personal memoirs by survivors. Some of them were theological in nature, interpreting the tragedy of Jewry as a punishment by God. It was around this time, can I apply the techniques that I used in writing my doctoral dissertation, that is the technique of the social sciences, to a description, to a historical, analytical evaluation of the Holocaust in Hungary. And it was along these lines that, hand in hand with publishing in political science, I began to publish specialized articles on the Holocaust in Hungary. And later I used these various chapters as the foundation for a 2-volume work that later came to be known as The Politics of Genocide. Many reviewers and individual readers asked me, how is it possible for you as a survivor of the Holocaust, whose parents and many family members were killed in Auschwitz, that you write so, quote unquote, objectively, cold-bloodedly, without passion or emotion? And my standard response was this: I tried to write the way a doctor who is called to perform an emergency operation on his mother. There is no place for emotion, for passion. Science must prevail. And I try to apply the same lesson to the writing to all of my writings on the Holocaust. That is, I try to be as objective as possible, reach conclusions on the basis of evidence available to me, always ready to reevaluate a conclusion on the basis of new evidence.
Braham's 2-volume work, The Politics of Genocide, The Holocaust in Hungary, is a remarkable gift to Hungarian historians, not matched in other countries, Poland, Germany or Russia, where the Holocaust claimed the lives of many more Jews.
I spoke to a large number of assimilated Jews, some of them even converted Jews, and I have the feeling that deep in their heart, their conscience still bothers them. I feel that there is a schism between them and the Christian Hungarians. And the reason for this chasm, for this schism, is that many of the Jews who followed the advice of the founders of the modern Hungarian state, Kossuth, Eötvös, Széchenyi, they assimilated, acculturated, converted, and some of them were even more Christian. They were absolutely Magyars in conviction. According to Paul Ignatius, they were more Magyars than the Magyars themselves. Yet, in 1944, after the German occupation, these Magyarized Jews suffered the same fate as the so-called Eastern Galician Jews who remained faithful to their faith, retained their tradition, they all ended up in Auschwitz. In other words, the assimilated Jews that I talked to, deep in their heart, felt that they were betrayed. But they don't speak about it. This is deep in their subconscious. As to the future of the Jewish community in Hungary, I'm a bit more positive, more optimistic about the future of this community as against that of Romania. Romania, that had the same pre-war population as Jewish population as Hungary, now its Jewish population is reduced to 6,000 to 8,000, mostly elderly and living in Bucharest. I'm almost convinced that we are witnessing the last chapter in the history of the Jews in Romania. In Hungary, I'm more optimistic because as I see the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors are becoming increasingly more interested in what happened in 1944. They establish organizations, study groups, and clearly they are interested in their Jewish roots.
On his 80th birthday in 2002, the Hungarian Ministry of Cultural Heritage honoured him with the highest Hungarian awards and a 800-page memorial book. 40 leading members of the Hungarian academic community contributed to the book, which honoured Professor Braham's work.
Nagyon köszönöm elismerő szavaikat, és azokat a kitüntetéseket, amelyeket nekem adományoztak. A tisztesség megköveteli, hogy bevalljam. Nagyon büszke vagyok, és rendkívül jól esik, hogy szívmelegítő elismeréseiket és a tekintélyes kitüntetéseket még lábon állva tudom elfogadni és megköszönni.
Obviously, I like to be with my family, my grandchildren, some of my friends. Occasionally, I go to movies or dining out. But in this advanced age, time is like a Damocles sword over my head. I'm always motivated to complete a particular job. I'm worried that I won't be able to finish what I had undertaken. I have so many projects lined up. And to me, time is absolutely essential. I hate to waste it. Occasionally I have nightmares, but many of these nightmares are connected with my hometown of Dej. I dream that I am back home, and I keep on wondering about myself, what made me leave New York to go back to Dej? And when I wake up with a smile, realizing that I am in my favorite town, the town that I came to love. Kiskút kerekesút van az udvarunkban, de szép barna kislány van a szomszédunkban. Csalfa szemeimet rá sem merem vetni, Fiatal az édesanyja, azt is kell szeretni. Ennek a szép barna lánynak dombon van a háza. Sudár jegenye van az udvarában, sudár jegenye földre hajlik az ága. Ennek a szép barna lánynak én leszek a párja.